Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Hello and welcome to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that now meets weekly on Zoom. Well, it's February, and today, in fact, is Valentine's Day, a holiday normally associated with love and romance, of course. But instead of invoking Cupid as our muse, Cineversary is going to turn to a cannibal for inspiration, namely Hannibal Lecter. Yes, the scene-stealing character from the film we're featuring this month, The Silence of the Lambs, which was released exactly 30 years ago today, February 14th, 1991. Now, it would have been a thrill to interview the movie's director, Jonathan Demme, but unfortunately, Jonathan passed away 4 years ago, leaving behind an impressive filmography. So instead, we were fortunate to get the film's co-producer, Ed Saxon, to join us for this installment. Ed and I are going to examine why The Silence of the Lambs is worth celebrating all these years later, its impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it's stood the test of time, and a lot more. But before descending into Lecter's labyrinth and Buffalo Bill's lair with Ed, what say we get up to speed on when, why, and how The Silence of the Lambs was made? Compliments of Wikipedia. The Silence of the Lambs is a 1991 American psychological horror film directed by Jonathan Demme and written by Ted Talley, adapted from the 1988 novel by Thomas Harris. It stars Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling, a young FBI trainee who is hunting a serial killer called Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, who skins his female victims. To catch him, Clarice seeks the advice of the imprisoned Dr. Hannibal Lecter, portrayed by Anthony Hopkins, a brilliant psychiatrist and cannibalistic serial killer. Scott Glenn and Anthony Heald also star in the film. The movie was the second adaptation of a Harris novel after Manhunter, released in 1986. The Silence of the Lambs grossed nearly $300 million worldwide on a $19 million budget, becoming the fifth highest grossing film of 1991 across the globe. It premiered at the 41st Berlin International Film Festival, where it competed for the Golden Bear Award, while Demme himself received the Silver Bear for Best Director. Silence of the Lambs became the third film, the other two being 1934's It Happened One Night and 1975's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, to win the Academy Awards in all top 5 categories. Now that includes Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Not too shabby. It is also the only Best Picture winner widely considered a horror film, and one of only 6 horror films to have been nominated in the category of Best Picture. This film is regularly cited by critics, film directors, and audiences as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made. In 2018, Empire magazine ranked it 48th on their list of the 500 greatest movies of all time. The American Film Institute ranked it number 74 on its 2007 list of the greatest American films ever, and also named it the 5th greatest and most influential thriller film in that category. Meanwhile, Starling and Lecter were ranked among the greatest film heroines and villains, respectively, by AFI in separate lists. The Silence of the Lambs is considered culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the U.S. Library of Congress, and it was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2011. A sequel, Hannibal, was released in 2001, followed by the prequels Red Dragon in 2002, and 5 years later, Hannibal Rising. The Silence of the Lambs earns a 96% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score comes in at 8.9 out of 10. Okay, ready for a stress test on your nerves? Sit back and feast your ears on the movie's original trailer.
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
He's past the others. The last cell. I'll be watching. You'll do fine.
The killer is on the loose.
Keeps them alive for 3 days. Then he shoots them, skins them, and dumps them.
A rookie FBI agent is on his trail.
He's got real physical strength, cautious, precise, and he's never impulsive. He'll never stop.
But in order to track him down, she'll have to match wits.
I'll help you catch him, Clary.
Believe me, you don't want Hannibal Lecter inside your head.
With the darkest of all minds.
Just do your job, but never forget what he is.
Oh, he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive.
So close to the way you're going to catch him. Do you realize that? Oh, Clarice, your problem is you need to get more fun out of life.
You told me you don't spook easily.
You call this easy, sir?
Lecter's missing an arm.
Man's a raving maniac. Who knows what he'll do?
Thank you, Clary. Thank you.
All right, so before I introduce my guest, fair warning part 1. Ed and I are going to dissect The Silence of the Lambs with all the precision of an expert coroner, which means you're about to hear, yes, spoilers. So if you're a Lambs newbie, why not pretend like it's 1991 all over again, screen the film finally, and reconvene with us at this paused point. Back with us? Great. Here's Fair Warning Part 2. The recorded audio of my guest is a bit less than desired, and you may hear an occasional crow or wild bird chiming in, which, if you think about it, actually sets a fitting macabre tone for a discussion about a film as darkly delicious as The Silence of the Lambs. But hey, my apologies for the audio imperfections, which thankfully aren't obtrusive enough to ruin our conversation. So stick with it, and I promise you will be rewarded with some insightful discussion about this month's movie. It's now my pleasure to welcome Academy Award-winning Hollywood producer Ed Saxon, whose filmography includes Something Wild, Married to the Mob, Philadelphia, Devil in a Blue Dress, That Thing You Do, Beloved, Adaptation, and Fast Food Nation. Welcome, Ed, and thanks for agreeing to appear on our show.
Great to be here, Eric.
So let's talk about the creation a little bit of The Silence of the Lambs. So how did you get interested and involved in this film as a producer? And what was it about the book and the prospects of adapting this story that excited you?
This is a funny one because it's the most successful film that I've been involved with in my career. And when they sent Jonathan Demme and I, we were partners. I was the producer, he was the director, and we produced other people's movies too. And when they sent us the book, I passed on it. I said, no, this isn't what we're looking to do. We were represented by the same agency that represented Tom Harris. And while I recognized that the book had fantastic commercial potential, we weren't in the market to do something about serial murder. We were high-mindedly looking for a movie that was more like Philadelphia, which was the next movie Jonathan directed, than we were The Silence of the Lambs. So we got the book. We passed. Gene Hackman and his producing partner took the book to Orion Pictures, the studio that we had our deal with as well. We developed other things. We found something that we wanted to make, but we wanted to make it as much because we needed to go back to work as we thought the script was really ready and great.
I see.
And then I get a call saying that Gene Hackman, who had developed the script, had gotten cold feet about directing it. He thought it had too much violence and difficult subjects. They were about to get a script in from Ted Talley. And rather than give us an answer on the one we wanted to do, would we wait and read Ted's script? Because they thought it might just turn out great. We said, sure. I reread the book. Jonathan read the book and realized that just the book was better than the script we were trying to get Orion to make. So we thought, this is a cracking good story.
Absolutely.
And so we waited, we read Ted's script, and it was stupendous. It was leagues better than the script we'd been working on. So we switched horses. I mean, we had a good script, but we didn't have a great script, and Ted's script was a great script.
That makes all the difference, right?
You're so right on there. The script is the blueprint, the architectural drawing, if you're building a building, you know. So we met with Ted, and he was delightful and brilliant, and worked on the script for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly we were off to the races.
Can you explain to our audience what a producer does briefly and what your responsibilities were as a co-producer on this film?
I really feel for anybody, including people in my business, trying to figure out from the credits of a movie what a producer does. There are so many different types of producers because the only prerequisite for getting a producer credit is the ability to get the credit.
Interesting.
Classically, what a producer does is move things to the next step. Script, budget, director, financing to make offers to cast, location scouting, all the way through. You keep doing that, moving to the next step, all the way until you're wondering what the advertising for the video streaming or digital distribution is, you know, a year later. And even what are you going to add to the Criterion Collection version? That could be years after
there you go.
the movie. So
my understanding was always that they make sure that the movie gets funded. They find, you know, the money people, so to speak, but also they're the first people to put their fingerprints on the project. Am I wrong?
Typically, the people who are associated more with the money and less with the creative, you try to get those people, according to the Producers Guild, to be called executive producers.
Mm-hmm.
The person who's more involved in making the movie and creatively making the movie is more likely to have the produced by credit.
Gotcha.
Now, that said, if Brad Pitt wants to star in a movie and he'll do it for 10% of his usual fee and it's a commercial subject, if Brad Pitt says, and by the way, I want Fido, my dog, to be one of the producers, that dog will get a producer credit.
Wow. And has that actually happened where pets get a pseudonym?
I can't remember. I once wondered if Melissa McCarthy's parrot would get a credit. What a movie star really is an actor who can star in a bad movie and it still makes money.
Right. The principal commodity, no question.
Yeah. And a producer, you know, and sometimes the company is much more the producer. You know, in the case of the Marvel movies, the company's often more important than the director. For those movies, they'll hire someone to direct a $150 million movie who's only made a very good $3 million movie. Basically, my job as a producer is if the director's job is 70% creative and 30% kind of the business and the nuts and bolts, the producer's job is 70% getting the ducks in a row, making sure the money's there, kind of supervising collaboration, and 30% the pure creative stuff. I spend most of my time talking with directors and writers. They go to me, can you get us some money for this? Or, hey, Ed, see if you can find an expert on this subject because we don't know enough about it.
Right.
We had experts on The Silence of the Lambs. Some really cool ones.
That's right. Especially that expert from the FBI, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, John Douglas.
That's right.
He became a star and had his own TV show because of the movie. John wrote a book himself that sold very well. And, you know, it's great when somebody who does what he did heroically, going out and trying to solve serial murders, gets, you know, some of the Hollywood pie, if you will.
Absolutely. So what were some of the biggest challenges involved in making The Silence of the Lambs, especially as a producer in your role? And what aspects were the most rewarding?
The challenging thing, kind of the thing that we all talked about when we were doing it, was to make a picture that wasn't exploitation. The reason I'd said no to the book in the first place, there were two reasons. One was that the previous Hannibal Lecter movie had been a good movie,
Manhunter,
but not a successful movie. So I thought, well, they tried this with a good man, and they made a good, Michael Mann and company made a good movie, but people didn't go to see it. Maybe this stuff's just too hardcore. And then the other hard thing was just this idea that we might be on the wrong side of the kinds of pictures that we like seeing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a good horror movie, but we had a good run and had a chance to do movies that were more than horror movies. And we didn't want to make a horror movie. We didn't want to make a movie that was just a thrill ride about scaring people. Would this picture have an emotional center? The challenge in some ways was not to take it too easy on ourselves
I see.
in thinking about the kind of movie we were making.
So what about the payoff? How about the most rewarding aspects?
I'm a cineast myself. I love movies, so it's rewarding to make something that people are entertained by for a long time and that touches the popular culture in such I rarely this sounds crazy to me now saying it, but I rarely go certainly 2 weeks without hearing the name Hannibal Lecter mentioned by someone in popular culture, on TV, in a conversation, and that's 30 years.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Crazy. Hannibal Lecter, Norman Bates, etc.
And now they're launching this new Clarice TV series on CBS. So, I mean, it never ends. It's great.
Indeed. So there's a satisfaction in that.
Sure.
I was talking to the FBI. I was got them to agree to let us be the first movie that's shot at Quantico.
That's right.
The number of women who applied to join the FBI shot up after Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The movie has a lot of kind of obvious signals that this is a woman in an institution that is so dominated by men. You think of that shot where Jodie's standing in that elevator surrounded by men.
Or surrounded by the state troopers at the funeral home. That's another one.
Great. Fantastic. Another one.
Mm-hmm.
You got it, Eric. So having that kind of thing happen is a good thing. And, then we were certainly part of an insane explosion in these forensic TV shows.
Of course.
That has kept going. Sometimes you make a movie and you're not where the culture is.
Uh-huh.
We made a movie called Something Wild. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Oh, I own it. It's one of my favorites.
Well, there you go. Well, Something Wild mixes comedy and violence. Pulp Fiction came out after Something Wild, and the culture turned a little bit more towards comedy and violence, feeling like they were a cocktail people would like. We were a few years too early with Something Wild.
Everything has to do with the zeitgeist, doesn't it? I mean, you have to have the right timing.
When you go into, even now, 2021, you're going in to pitch a story at a funder, and they say, why now? Why is this? That's a question you always have to be ready to answer. Why is this a story for right now? And for many reasons, some of which I'm in touch with, some of which I'm not, The Silence of the Lambs was a story for 1990-91.
Absolutely. And you think about how rare it is that it wins in the top 5 categories of the Academy Awards. I mean, it's released over 12 months earlier, and it emerges victorious on Oscar night. Now, that is a rarity, right?
We had so much against us. I'd gone to the Golden Globes. All those same people had been nominated, and only Jodie Foster won. We went to the Oscars thinking, well, maybe Jodie will win. And then we all, just about all of us got it. That was a fun night.
Well, the hits kept coming for you and your team afterward. I mean, you think of movies like Philadelphia and some others, of course. But, Silence of the Lambs, as you said, it just was the right movie for the right time. And to sweep the Oscars like it did, to launch this cottage industry of similar type of content on television and in film. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Just the legacy. We're talking about it 30 years later. It's all over the news again. It tells you that it really touched a nerve in a good way with audiences, and it became part of pop culture. So that's a testament to a movie with staying power.
Yeah. In film terms, where so much has changed in the 30 years. The pace of storytelling, for example.
Yes, right.
We're hanging in there as something that still seems to pull people in.
Do you have a favorite memory working on this production that you can share? Maybe a humorous or perhaps a poignant or even a thrilling moment that you cherish, Ed?
Yeah. One was that, when you're making a movie, and I think when you're writing a book, if you're painting a picture, you don't know what you've got when you're making it. So I remember watching the dailies from The Silence of the Lambs, and the scene where Clarice and Hannibal are talking in the cell, and he says, "Tell me about the lambs." The big scene.
The one that probably won them both their Oscars,
Yes.
right? Where he's in the cage.
Exactly. I'm watching that in the dailies, the day after we shot it. And Jonathan shot it all in these extreme close, or most all of it in these extreme close-ups.
Incredible.
Looking right into the camera. I'm the producer. I'm this guy's partner. I've been through every draft of the script. I'm in every casting decision. And I'm going, oh my God, this is just Little Red Riding Hood. We're just remaking Little Red Riding Hood. I'm going to eat you, little girl. This is so obvious. And now we're doing it in extreme close-up. Oh my God, we're lost. When you make decisions like creative decisions, like we're going to not get any coverage, shoot an extreme close up, when you burn some bridges, you do that when you're going to make something great, but you can also do it and make a big mistake. So,
Sure.
Part of the job of a producer is helping people remember here's where the middle of the road is. And okay, I want to make sure you really believe it. Okay, let's go over there. I'm not going to fight you. It's, the buck stops with me on how much money we get to spend, and the buck stops with you on the creative approach. And so you need to always kind of be awake and alive to that and know about yourself, sometimes about your taste. You might be a little more timid than the person you're teamed up with. So to me, the funny thing about the story is, man, you're making a movie that's going to win 5 Academy Awards and you still think it sucks in the middle of making it. And the sad part is making other movies that don't turn out as well. You're writing your Oscar speech on the way home.
You never know, right?
You just don't know when you're in the middle of it. And I think that's true of making a podcast and of making a movie.
Well, it's interesting taking the devil's advocate approach of looking, as you said, at the rushes or the dailies of those fantastic close-up scenes of the sequence we were talking about. That's a great story to share. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I've got one. I've got to tell you one. When we were looking at when to put the movie out, believe me, we weren't thinking about awards potential, but just like the best day. It was Jonathan Demme who said, put it out on Valentine's Day. Horror movies are great date movies.
Wow.
Because you're grabbing at each other when you're scared.
Yeah.
And by then we knew we had a scary movie on our hands. And I used to love, my wife got sick of it, to go sit in the front row of the movie theater when Jody is going to James Gunn's house just to watch people grab each other. Because people really, when you sat in the front row and looked backwards, people, with the audience lit up by the screen, they just grab each other. I'd love to have gone on a first date with a girl to see that, because you're like, you get somebody's heart beating fast. They go, oh, maybe I should have my heart beat
Just
fast.
imagine being one among that virgin audience who actually stepped in a theater on Valentine's Day, 1991, and maybe they had no idea what they were up for, but just to talk to those people, get their reaction, I'll bet you get some very interesting responses.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Let's do a deeper dive at this point and talk about why The Silence of the Lambs still matters 3 decades later. It's been 30 years, 30th birthday of Silence of the Lambs coming this Sunday. So, Ed, how has it stood the test of time, and why does the movie still matter? What's your take here?
I think the good story, well-told part of it can't be discounted. There aren't many, in reading the script and watching the movie, the moment when Jodie Foster rings a doorbell and the FBI is breaking into a different house, the misdirection in that moment.
The parallel editing is amazing.
Before James Gunn answers is shocking, wonderful, so hard to do in storytelling. It works in the book. It works on the page. That's a miracle. We made it work on the screen. Hannibal Lecter being the guy in the ambulance with the other person's face on his face.
Yes, right.
Brilliant escape scene, but we pulled it off. So just that kind of the plotting, the plot mechanics and the surprises, in a world where we're inundated with stories, are awfully good.
I totally agree. It's that exceptional craftsmanship. You think about the way the movie turns the tables on you by employing those techniques. You just mentioned the scene in the ambulance, the cross-cutting parallel action kind of editing sequence with the doorbells. It's incredible the way they turn the tables on the audience.
And again, they're just so hard to do. I aspire to coming up with them. And, I worked on a television show called Ray Donovan that had a lot of that kind of stuff. And you like bust your head for weeks over those things to kind of try to come up with a way to do these magic tricks, if you will. Look over here, no over here, here it is.
Sure.
Really hard to do in storytelling. The acting in the movie, the directing and the acting and the production design, it all feels really of a piece, that and it's not an accident, but sometimes it comes together and sometimes it doesn't. We've made a movie with this crew, 2 movies with half of the crew. And, so it was a kind of a nicely oiled machine, if you think of a sports team as a metaphor.
Sure. It feels synergistic to me.
What that does, the reason that that's important is it allows you to have more conversations, because time is always your enemy when you're making a film.
Sure.
because you know a lot of stuff about how that person works, you can spend your time on the more important conversations. And I think as importantly as anything for the picture's endurance was we had a theme that was resonant. And it's a theme Jodie Foster said to us, for me, this is a story about a woman saving another woman from something that, she felt that she could connect with and happened to her. What I do when I go to work is try to make an emotion machine. I want people to feel something. And so I think that The Sounds of the Lambs endures because you feel something. You want Jodie Foster to catch. You want, it's like creating the characters' desires and fears get transmitted to the audience, creating emotion. That's why we all go to the movies.
Oh, it's so well put. And I totally agree. And just to kind of riff on that thought, when you think about the techniques used to kind of fuel that emotion machine, from the start, we identify with and we admire Clarice. She's this small, outnumbered female in a world dominated by men. And we often see her point of view or the point of view of those who look at her, who watch her. But we're commonly reliant on her discovery of the facts to help uncover the mystery. And I find it so interesting, getting back to this clever technique kind of approach. Near the end of the film, the POV shifts abruptly after the lights go out in Buffalo Bill's subterranean lair. And suddenly, we're given Bill's perspective, which shows a terrified Clarice seen through the night vision goggles. And that makes us all the more fearful for her. And then you mentioned, the clever escape sequence with Hannibal and the ambulance, the parallel editing with the doorbells, but also the amazing sound design, Ed, throughout the film, especially that climactic scene in the lair where she enters Bill's home. But we hear barking, yelling, rock music. You hear these flapping sounds of moths. You hear heavy breathing. And it all adds up to this unnerving kind of audio wallpaper. And earlier, like you think of the scene where, they extract the moth from the victim's throat, you hear this subtle but strange and disembodied breathing, almost like an exhalation when that moth is removed, as well as like this low-frequency rumbling, water plops, really interesting sound design. So I have to give props to you and your team for the sound design, especially in this film.
I got such a big smile. You can't see me, Eric. I have such a big smile on my face. Our sound designer, Skip Livesay, is brilliant. He does all the Coen Brothers movies. I remember the scene where Jodie meets Hannibal Lecter for the first time, when she gets the don't go near the glass, don't touch the glass, that scene. I'm in the mix going, wow, what is that? Skip says, well, that's a submarine.
That's funny.
Skip was inspired by Jonathan Demme. One of the great things about Jonathan is he would encourage people to believe in themselves and to completely take charge, credit, responsibility for the work that they did, not so that he could edit it, but it's like, give me the thing that you've always wanted to do. Make this one for you, creative person. And when you make films, you're working with people who are very creative in their own right, but are serving the director and sometimes the producer. And Jonathan, and I try to do this myself in my practice, my first order is just knock yourself out. Make yourself happy. This one's for you. So when you say to someone as talented as Skip Livesay, go crazy, knock yourself out. Thrill me with what you're doing, the actor. And when you take that approach with creative people of just saying yes in such a big way, some really great things can happen, kind of letting each artisan do their thing.
That's great. Just getting out of the way and letting talented people do their stuff. That's a testament to good leadership. I have to give you credit as well, you and your team. So it's just one of so many great examples of why this movie has stood the test of time. If you bear with me, I want to just lay this other case here as an exhibit to the jury. But yeah, you think about how Silence of the Lambs remains this innovative study in suspense and horror. I mean, let's face facts here. Horror is often the bastard stepchild genre for scholars and, the haughty-taughty. But this is the only film to ever win the Best Picture Oscar as a horror movie. And I get it. It doesn't necessarily fit in the horror bin, exclusively. It can be a psychological thriller. It could be a drama. It could be a lot of things. But let's face facts. This is a horror movie to a lot of people, including me.
What's the story? It's a movie about a guy who skins people and a guy who eats people.
That's right.
I think that satisfies the horror.
I think that checks the horror box quite nicely. But it's a horror movie in which, Ed, the hero is a woman. The leading man is a psychopathic killer who eats people, as you said. There's no sex or romance. There are two monsters, one on the loose and the other who's caged, at least for most of the film. And you think about the two monsters. Buffalo Bill may be more abhorrent to us, but Hannibal is just as violent, dangerous, and loathsome, although what's interesting is that the audience is rooting for him to express his intelligence, to match wits with Clarice, and to aid her in her task, which makes him more sympathetic. And I'm going to quote Jonathan, who said in an interview here that it's a suspense movie with a female protagonist who is never in sexual peril. It's a slasher movie that is devoid not only of slasher scenes, but of the anticipation of seeing them. And just speaking of its horror roots, it's riveting to me, Ed, because there's a time limit involved. We know that Clarice only has 3 days in which to find Buffalo Bill or his captive will be killed. And then you think about it showcases its genre roots really well. It riffs on things like Frankenstein, Nosferatu, King Kong, Psycho. They all contain monsters that to some extent Lecter resembles or makes us think of, as well as 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, I was reading, and I'm sure you can testify, that the villain, HAL 9000, the computer in the movie, it inspired Hopkins' performance, he had revealed. And then you think about a movie like Aliens, starring Sigourney Weaver, right, the sequel to Alien. That's another horror film that features a strong female protagonist who hunts monsters and plays the part of a rescuer. And lastly, it features brief cameos by two renowned horror directors, Silence of the Lambs does. You have Roger Corman and George Romero. So my point is that it stays really true to horror predecessors, and I think it does the genre a lot of justice.
That's Demi. He came out of Roger's brilliant company where they, just people would say to other people, hey, you got a script? Maybe we should make it. He was a movie watching machine and loved exploitation. It's a funny one for me. When you collaborate with a director over the course of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, however many movies he directed, you get to know the person inside and out and what they're into. And for this one, it was a movie where Jonathan just decided he was going to put on his German engineer hat. He kept his humanity, but it was like, we're going to make this one and keep everything really tight. We're going to keep what's going to happen next in question working the whole time, because we could be pretty discursive and look what's around that corner, Joe. It's pretty interesting.
Right.
That was what Jonathan was known for, his interest in what was around the next corner. But that didn't always serve keeping the narrative tight. But this one, he was so exacting with himself,
It shows.
Great directors find a way to surrender and find the essence of the material.
Well said.
That's what makes a Mike Nichols, or these directors who can do different things.
Sure. And Demi, of course, is such a diverse director in so many different veins. You think of his body of work. It's not like he pigeonholed himself in one genre or anything. But I definitely want to talk about ways the film was influential on cinema and pop culture. And we started to talk about this earlier. You think about the knockoffs and homages and pictures like Seven and Copycat, Kiss the Girls, Beyond Bedlam, The Cell, When the Bow Breaks, The Bone Collector. All these things came in its wake, as did, you mentioned CSI, NCIS, Criminal Minds, Bones, Without a Trace, even the X-Files to some extent. It created this whole cottage industry of sequels, prequels, TV shows based on the film's characters. You had the 3 subsequent movies featuring Lecter, the NBC series Hannibal. We mentioned the brand new CBS show Clarice, which debuts this month. It's a movie that's constantly been referenced in pop culture. You think of spoofs and parodies in films like Austin Powers, A Goldmember, Fatal Instinct, Dumb and Dumber, The Simpsons, South Park, Family Guy. This speaks to something that the public has just embraced and loved. Yeah, what would you say in terms of its influence on cinema or pop culture?
You give people something that boils it down and is compelling, it stays with them. I go back to the Little Red Riding Hood. I'm sure the Brothers Grimm, I bet they wrote a bunch of stories that were just bombs. But, but a few of them were like, just distilled something. And I think that in Hannibal Lecter, especially, there's a character that feels both, wow, that person could really exist among us, but is elevated, and that's Hopkins' performance.
Right.
It's Harris's writing. It's really researching some of these serial killers.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned Roger Corman, because Jonathan told me Roger would always talk about make the villain sympathetic. You know, great villains, you feel something for. They're not Godzilla. They're nuanced. So for me, I think part of it is when Hannibal Lecter says he's drawn the Uffizi as seen from the Duomo in Florence.
Right.
And he says, I want a view. And you feel this culture. You feel like it's real. That gives the character this kind of shading. So as much as anything, I think having a dimensional villain who also is a step ahead of you is a big piece of that.
You think about movies that came before Silence of the Lambs. It's a sea change, this movie, because the predecessors typically, they depicted psycho killers and mentally deranged sociopaths, but this movie attempts to employ a forensic psychology approach to better understanding the mindset and motivations for the criminals. You think of earlier films like Psycho, for example, brilliant movie, or Halloween or Friday the 13th, various sequels, and therein. The forensic psycho thriller gave the psycho film psychological motivation. I'm quoting a reviewer by the name of Richard Scheib here, but he said that it took a glimpse inside the heads of psychopaths and what made them tick behaviorally. Silence of the Lambs did. I think that's a great credit to the groundbreaking aspect of this movie and how it changed movies or other content about forensic psychology and serial killers. So that's no small feat.
Eric, that was inspired so totally by the work of the FBI.
Sure.
You know, John Douglas interviewed these people so that he could go, when they're killing, if we know how they work, if we understand their minds, we'll better be able to catch them.
The problem, though, is that they didn't know this guy existed. And it's a movie like Silence of the Lambs that helps kind of brings a voice like that to the forefront, right?
Yeah, definitely. So that, you know, that's a piece of it too. There's nothing like taking a little scene culture and really painting it in a dimensional way, any community, to make for, you know, even this year's movies. You know, take a movie like Moonlight, you know, it's like, oh, that's a little subset of the world that I didn't know. You know, if you do that with truth, it moves people.
No, that's well put. That's a great example. So you were talking about some major themes of the film. I want to introduce one here that get your take on it, but breaking through barriers, I see as a message or motif of the film. You think about Clarice. She's this lone female in a male-dominated profession, right? She's challenged with breaking through the glass ceiling. And symbolically, the film features multiple barred doors that Starling has to pass through to enter the domains of both Lecter and Buffalo Bill. She has to ascend. Think of the first sequence of the film where she's doing the training. She's climbing up the hill. She's jumping over the barriers. And later, she has to descend through different levels to achieve her goals. So that's kind of interesting. And then you think about like usurped gender conventions. You consider that Bill is a seamstress, and that's regarded by many as a female vocation, or at least it was in 1991, while Clarice is a rugged and resourceful FBI agent, a role often assigned to males, right?
Bingo. Those are certainly true. We talked, for example, endlessly about what would Lecter's cell look like, and Chrissy Zia, our brilliant production designer, came up with the plexiglass idea.
It's great.
The mask Lecter wears is yet another shield.
It's so iconic.
There are all kinds of basic things that get to identity, gender, barriers. And all of the great thing about all that stuff is in the thriller horror genre, making these elemental things seem urgent and contemporary is, if you can, you know, it's almost like, how do we boil this down to its very basic and then just get that right?
Whatever you guys did was great.
Well, that's always the kind of imperative, so that you kind of know it when you see it.
Sure.
And it's often like, what if the thing that's separating them is nothing? You know, clear thing. What if Hannibal Lecter, far from being a madman, he talks like a computer?
Yeah.
It's like, take whatever it is that's expected and then cut against it, boil it down, make it elemental.
Well, here's another theme that I think can be universally accepted, and it was pointed out by Roger Ebert, who I'm going to kind of paraphrase here, but pairing and twinning. You know, he pointed out how Lecter and Clarice, they serve as parallel characters, and he said that both are ostracized by the worlds they want to inhabit. Lecter by the human race because he's a serial killer and a cannibal, and Clarice by the law enforcement profession because she's a woman. Both feel powerless. Lecter because he's locked in a maximum security prison, and Clarice because she's surrounded by men who tower over her and fondle her with their eyes. Both use their powers of persuasion to escape from their traps, and both share similar childhood wounds. Very well put, I thought, in analyzing a major theme in the movie. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, what I'd add to that is that to some extent, both characters are alienated from their own emotional life because of their childhood trauma. They're both working from the head, and it's hard to touch the heart. Part of that sparring is that Lecter talks to Clarice about her father. Did he stink of the lamp?
Yes.
and wants to go into places that make her connect to her heart, and it feels like a dangerous place to go.
Yeah, true.
And she does the same thing with him. You know, you see a lot, Dr. Lecter, you know, and he can smell her, etc. But she challenges him, which is why he loves it and erotically rises to it.
Mm-hmm.
Challenges this smart guy to, hey, look in the mirror. There's a monster there too, buddy. You're such an aesthete. You like fine cooking and you like beautiful things, but you're savage.
Yeah, that's nicely articulated. This, of course, is a birthday celebration. It's 30 years for Silence of the Lambs. I always contend to my guests that birthdays are all about getting presents, except that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So, Ed, what is this film's greatest gift to viewers?
I think it's to forget your troubles and surrender to a story. I mean, I like to say, Eric, that even a bad movie is better than real life. And, you know, I love to watch movies. And so, you know, watching a movie that really got lucky and is really great is just its own joy. I think it's to go, yeah, there are really good ones out there. The other thing I'd say, knowing that you've got frequent movie watchers, when you want to turn on, you know, for me, often it's like, oh, I heard that movie's kind of heavy. Whenever I hear a movie and I'm trying to decide between something that may not be as original and one that's kind of heavy, I'm almost always glad when I watch the one that's kind of heavy. I can't tell you how many people over the years have said to me, I haven't seen it. It's too much. You know, movies get in your head. And so, I don't know. I think it's also to go for the people who are afraid to watch it, you know, or didn't want to like engage their emotion. There's a message in there, which is, you know, have a strong heart, engage your emotion, go for it.
Yeah, I think it's such an uplifting movie because of the character of Clarice. She's such an inspirational character for men and women alike, but especially women. And I think that's more relevant today than it even was 30 years ago. So she was really ahead of her time, at least the way she was written and personified by Jodie Foster. So credit to you guys again for creating such an indelible, iconic character. Not only Hannibal Lecter, of course. I mean, we have to give credit where credit is due. I mean, he has become the de facto greatest horror villain probably of the last 30 years. But equally great to me is the character of Clarice. She's this sturdy, resourceful, quick-witted heroine, and she's just aged so gracefully over 30 years. So those people who continue to tell you, oh, I can't take it, I don't know if I would want to watch Silence of the Lambs, you just tell them, hey, by the end of the film, you're going to feel good. That's what I would tell those people.
Yeah, I do. There are many movies I've been involved with that I go, watch it. Not enough people watched it. This one, thank God, I don't have to say that.
So to me, two of the film's greatest gifts are, of course, the characters of Clarice and Hannibal Lecter. But Silence of the Lambs' third greatest gift is its subjective camera and commitment to close-ups. By continually bringing us up close and personal to the characters' faces, we're provided an often unsettling, intimate view into the minds of these characters, particularly Starling and Lecter. These POV shots are logical in that we see through his or her eyes, and we're then given a counterpoint shot, but these tight shots are most effective psychologically because they eliminate the periphery and they focus intently on what the character is seeing, hearing, perceiving, and experiencing, causing the viewer to do the same. I want to quote Jonathan Demme himself, who said, "The most powerful shot of all is when you put the viewer right in the shoes of one of the characters so they are seeing exactly what the character is seeing." Do you think that Silence of the Lambs will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 30 years? What's going to happen 30 years from now? Are we still going to be talking about and watching this movie?
I'm tempted to think so, only because I can't believe how long things are hanging around these days. Like the Beatles, you know, I have kids. I'm in my 60s. The Beatles are to my kids Al Jolson was to me. So like, I don't know. So I think the good stuff, the really good stuff, kind of sticks around. So I think the audience will get smaller, but I don't think it'll be hard to find it to watch.
That's well put. I would agree, and I think that bodes well for the future and the legacy of the Silence of the Lambs. So before we let you go, is there anything you're currently working on, Ed, that listeners should check out or know about?
There's nothing. I'm deeply into a TV series that we haven't announced, so I'll hold off. Let's promote somebody else's stuff that I've liked. I watched The Mauritanian that's going to be coming out soon with Jodie Foster.
I've heard about this, right?
Kevin McDonald's movie about Guantanamo. And I'm a sucker for political themes, but I thought this movie has some really dynamite performances.
And I don't think she's been in anything in quite a few years, right? So this is...
She hasn't. She's wonderful. It's based on a true story, and so go watch The Mauritanian.
There you go. Ed, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us here on Cineversary. You were very generous with your time, and I'm most appreciative.
Keep doing this, Eric. How nice that your movies can have birthdays, you know? It's such an adorable concept.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, well, keep up the great work, and now I'm a listener.
You take care now.
You too, bye-bye.
Yeah, over the past 3 years, I have been lucky enough to interview film directors, screenwriters, TV hosts, critics, scholars, and podcasters. But a title that had remained elusive as a guest was producer. I can now tick that one off my bucket list, thanks to producer Ed Saxon saying yes to Cineversary. Hey Ed, thanks again. We move now to standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers like you. Well, another great film is marking a 30th anniversary this month. It's Boys in the Hood. And to commemorate this landmark picture, as well as Black History Month, Turner Classic Movies and Fathom Events are bringing it back to the big screen at select theaters on February 28th and March 3rd. Boys in the Hood was written and directed by John Singleton. Now, this was his feature directorial debut, and it stars Ice Cube, Cuba Gooding Jr., Lawrence Fishburne, and Angela Bassett. It tells the story of Trey Styles, played by Gooding Jr., who was sent to live with his father, portrayed by Fishburne, in South Central Los Angeles, and who witnesses firsthand the neighborhood's booming gang culture. And you know what? The hits don't stop there. Also on Fathom's slate of anniversary releases in the first half of 2021 are The Ten Commandments, slated for March 28th and 31st. You've got Fried Green Tomatoes coming up on May 9th, 12th, and 13th. And you've got the 25th anniversary of The Birdcage on June 27th, 28th, and 30th. For full details, theaters, and showtimes, visit fathomevents.com. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. And yep, that brings us to the close of another episode of your favorite podcast. Next month, we stay within the same decade, but we move forward 5 years to 1996 as we honor perhaps the greatest work in the Coen brothers canon, Fargo, celebrating a 25th anniversary in March. Yeah. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies, because they're not getting older, they're getting Lecter. I mean better. Thanks again for listening.